One of the latest fourth generation nuclear power plants has just come online in the Middle East. The Barakan nuclear power plant in the UAE has reached full capacity, generating a staggering 40 terawatt hours of electricity annually. This monumental energy transit generation by the first nuclear plant in the Arab world supplies around 25% of the nation's electricity needs. To put this into perspective, the amount of clean energy is nearly equivalent to the entire annual electricity consumption of New Zealand. And this is in the heart of the world's largest oil and gas producing region, and one where water scarcity is a fact of life. How do all these factors integrate? How do the various countries navigate the risks and opportunities of these challenges? In this episode, we're privileged to talk to a recent USC PhD student, Dr. Gena Al Hanai, whose dissertation focused on this problem.
Well, hi, Dr. El Hanan. Thank you so much for joining us on this episode of the Energy Transition Podcast. We're so happy to have you here.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, so can you tell us a little bit about yourself, about your research at USC, under Dr. Muscati? What attracted you to get involved with civil and environmental engineering?
I'll give a little bit of background, and I think that will make sense how I ended up where I ended up. So, I grew up in the United Arab Emirates, and I completed my undergrad there back home in UAE in mechanical engineering. And my undergrad university was tied to the oil and gas company of the UAE. And so a lot of our projects that we were working on were connected to the industry. And as part of our degree, we were required to complete an internship and work one summer for the oil and gas industry. So that's where I would say was my first real exposure to the energy industry. And then I came to the US for my master's. I applied to Stanford University, and then I was surprised to receive an acceptance letter. And I went ahead and accepted before they could change their mind about me, and moved to the US and did my master's in energy resources engineering. And I chose specifically energy resources engineering because I wanted to get more of a holistic understanding of the energy industry. The department was heavily focused on oil and gas, but they did have other courses and electives where you could kind of learn about different types of energy. And around this time in my education was when UAE announced that they were going to embark upon a nuclear power program. And this would be the first of its kind there in the region. And so construction started, I think the same year that I was starting my master's, construction was starting. And so I was really curious, keeping up with the news, what's going on, what's happening, the whole process and everything. And then towards the end of my master's degree, I was looking into PhD programs. And I got accepted in the Civil and Environmental Engineering department at USC. And what drew me specifically to that department was the wide scope of research that was taking place in the department and the interdisciplinary aspect that the department had. And so there was flexibility to be working on a really wide range of topics. I visited the university, I saw the different research that was taking place in the department, and I decided to join. And Yes, and the other thing that played a role also was that I felt that was a friendly, collaborative environment to be in. And of course, when you're going to be somewhere for 5, 6 years doing a PhD, I think that's an important factor to look for. And so, yes, I ended up choosing USC, and I actually started off working on a different project for my PhD. And I then took a class with Dr. Mishkati, whom you know. And as part of that class project, he allowed us to basically choose any topic that we were interested in and apply the principles that we learned in that class on that topic of our choice. And so, because I had this interest as what was going on in my home country, the nuclear program, I decided to focus my research paper and final project on that. And Dr. Mishkati, as you know, he is very supportive of his students. And when he read my paper, he was really interested in working further on the topic and told me we should publish a paper together and work more on this topic. So I was excited. Okay, I can take this a little bit further. I was really interested in it. So I was working on that alongside my research that I was already working on for my PhD. It was still first year, so very, very early stages. It wasn't like I was deep into anything. And my current advisor at the time, my current PhD advisor at that time, saw how interested I was in the topic I was working on with Dr. Mishkati. And so one day he calls me in for a meeting, and I was a little bit worried. What did I do? What are you meeting about? So he called me into his office, and I'll always remember this meeting. There were key people throughout my journey that really supported me in helping me, I would say, as they say, spread my wings and fly during the PhD program. Firstly, my family, my parents, they always encouraged me, and then several people along the way. And one of these people was this advisor who I really remember this meeting. And so he sat me down in this meeting, and he told me basically, I noticed how excited you are to work on this topic that you're working on the side with Dr. Mishkati. And I want you to know that if you prefer to work on that project and make that your PhD project and switch advisors and go work with Dr. Mishkati, 100% I will support you. And he told me, this at the end of the day is your PhD. It's not mine. So it's not about what I want you to do. You have to decide what you want to do. And that was such a key moment of support for me. And I sat with that after that meeting, thought about it, and I realized he's right. I was really interested in working on this project. And he real recognized that potential in me before I recognized it in myself. And that gave me the courage, I would say, to make that step. And I ended up switching advisors, and my former advisor became one of my committee members for my PhD. And it was, I mean, it was a great support network that I ended up having in the department that I'm super, super grateful to have. And I think that's also a strength in the people that I was surrounded with, that they were able to to see where the potential in me was and to pull that out of me and to support me throughout my PhD journey. And so, yeah, I'm incredibly grateful for that, my initial advisor who really launched me into that. So I then started working under Dr. Mishkati, whom you know, who is another gifted individual who really knows how to uplift his students, how to bring out their potential. And his office, if you've ever been to visit his office, is a revolving door. There's non-stop students coming to his office, whether they are current students, whether they are former students, whether they are students who have graduated. It was really difficult to have a meeting with Dr. Mishkati in his office without being interrupted 20 times by somebody wanting something. And he always had a welcoming smile, opening his office door and welcoming students in. Okay, and then I guess to answer the part about my research, so UAE, of course, started construction on the first nuclear power plant. What was really interesting to me was the unique tapestry in the UAE. So it's located on the Arabian or Persian Gulf, depending on who you're talking to. They'll either refer to it as the Arabian Gulf or Persian Gulf. And it's, of course, the UAE is a key player in oil and gas. But on top of that, the region is incredibly water scarce. And so they rely heavily on this Gulf water, this body of water, for their water needs. So they rely very heavily on desalination of the water to get their water needs. And so already you kind of have interdependent relation between the oil and gas industry using this body of water and the desalination industry using this body of water. And of course, if something happens to the body of water, both industries are impacted. Um, and so now, when you're looking at it from, okay, the UAE was embarking on a nuclear program, and now these nuclear reactors are also going to be dependent on this body of water. And also, whatever happens to this body of water impacts now the nuclear reactors as well, there was so many interdependencies happening. And then that's only looking at it from the UAE perspective. If you zoom out now, you take a magnifying lens, you zoom out, and you're talking now about the other countries around that are also dependent on this body of water. It's just a layer on top of layer of interdependencies and complex connections that are really linked to this body of water. And you don't want to be, of course, figuring out all these relationships when you are in the middle of a catastrophe, right? You want to understand these relationships well before something happens so that you know how to respond because you're talking about multiple complex industries, large scale industries that can be impacted if a situation were to arise. So you want to be already having understood those relationships and being able to react to something, right? Than trying to figure it out. So that was what my research was about. Hopefully that made sense, the connections in these industries. So my research focused on developing a framework to understand all these relationships because these industries work very independently of each other. So yeah, that's the the gist of it.
Yeah, wow, that's incredible. Thank you.
You're welcome.
So you were named by the MIT Technology Review as one of the world's leading innovators under 35. Could you tell us a little bit about how you got that amazing honor?
Yeah, I was really honored to be selected for that. So the process works by someone can nominate you for the award, and then they reach out to you if they're interested to know more about you and your work and what you've done. So I received, I think it was an email or a phone call. I think probably an email that I was nominated. So then there was a sort of kind of interview or vetting process, checking details about you, what you're working on, what your research is, providing references and so on that they could talk to. And then it goes through like a judge review, like a judge panel, where you have judges reviewing your work and then the work of all the nominees, and then they kind of cut down the list and make their final selections. So that's how that came about.
And what was the what was it for? Was it for your work with
It was specifically
the
for my research. Yes, yes, it was specifically for the research that I was working on, interdependency between oil, water, and nuclear.
and you made the list twice when you got the same thing for a top innovator under 35 in the Middle East and North Africa as well. Was that for the same thing?
Yes, it was the same thing. And I definitely didn't expect it once and definitely did not expect it twice. So yeah, I was really humbled to be selected for Middle East and then the global one.
It's incredible.
Thank you.
Yeah, and as you've mentioned before, like your research focuses on environmental sustainability, energy resources, water, and food security. You're designing a framework to prevent and prepare the Persian Gulf region, including the UAE, in the event of of a disaster. That's a huge responsibility, and scope. What inspired you to tackle such a complex topic, and how did you go um, about it with your research?
Mhm. So I think I kind of covered the background of how I got to be interested in it, and specifically it was really interesting because it was a unique combination, and it was happening right in my hometown, like my backyard. It felt like. So that really helped me because I was familiar with the region, the country, the industries, and even already having some of those connections, like in the oil and gas industry, for example, the university I studied in was connected to the oil and gas industry. Um, and then how I went about the research, I don't even know where to begin to answer this question because I think anyone who's in a PhD program you can probably relate to this that you start at point A and you think you're going to go through point B, C, D, and then E, F, and you're done. But it does not happen that way. You suddenly find yourself at point W, and then you're back at point B again because that route didn't work. And then something else, some other hurdle comes up. You're unable to get some data maybe that you anticipated being able to get, and so on. So it was really a trial and error. And also, I mean, the difficult part of it is that you're working on something that you nobody has worked on before, so you don't really have people that you can directly go to give you guidance on exactly what you're working on. You know, you can, so it was a little bit difficult. So I did make a lot of connections in terms of experts. So experts in the oil and gas industry, experts in the nuclear industry, experts in desalination, and was grateful to even get data from these different industries that helped throughout my research. And one of the and luckily when I defended also these experts because they were in different parts of the world, when I did my PhD defense, it happened to be COVID time, so it was a defense on Zoom, so they were able to join. So that was a nice ending to the project. But yeah, one of the benefits specifically about being from UAE is that it is a really, really small country. So the population is roughly a little over 9 million. And to put that into perspective, that's barely a quarter of California. So it's a really small country. And then on top of that, the actual local population, the Emiratis, as we call them, is only about 10% of that. So, and many of them working in these government entities. And so the chance that I have a local friend who is working in one of these industries is high, or a friend whose uncle works in the other industry, or things like that. You know, the connections are because it's such a small community, there was a benefit there that I was able to get connected through people by, 1 degree removed, 2 degree removed, somebody would know somebody in different industries. So that really helped. My own father actually was working in the oil and gas industry for 25 years, retired, and then decided to go work again and worked for the nuclear industry and then retired just a few months ago, actually retired from the nuclear industry. So I also had that connection that was helpful because he was working in those industries. And so that was really beneficial. Having those connections because I was from there and having built those connections growing up was incredibly beneficial to get support from these different entities, to access data, to get resources, and so on. That was really critical, being able to get access to these resources. And then, of course, I had to make the decisions of what data I want to analyze, what relationships to draw, how to analyze this data, how deep to go into something. It was really like a, a rabbit hole, to the point even that when I was doing, I had a review point maybe 2 years before I graduated or a year before I graduated. And I had to present my work up to that point to the committee. And I remember that their final point of advice for me in that review point was that it is too much. You need to cut, 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 because you're going to be here for 10 years if you don't cut this down. And so there was also a point of relief for me because I was like, okay, I think we have enough data. It's just a matter of really narrowing the scope and figuring out how to conclude this because there's so many different avenues you can take, especially when you're talking about three large scale industries and how you want to analyze things and so on. So that's a process that I went through. It was really trial and error, talking to different experts, trying to figure out what makes sense. It was also dependent on what data we could get, and so on. So hopefully that gives a summary of how that went about.
Yeah, absolutely. And what was some of the type of data that you ended up focusing in on?
Yeah, so some of the data included, for example, events that happened at nuclear reactors. So, for example, in the US, they have these licensee event reports, and it's different events that happen at reactors. It's not an event that necessarily leads to anything, leads to a catastrophe and so on, but it's events that, okay, maybe this required maintenance or this part failed or this thing. It didn't lead to anything, but it's super helpful to analyze all those little things that could go wrong and seeing how they're fixed and also seeing patterns, right? If there's a part maybe that keeps failing and so on, because it's the right set of events happening in a cascading way that coincide at a point that can turn into a catastrophe. So we looked at all these different types of events that didn't even lead to anything, but could have led to something, and that type of data.
Yeah, That's incredible. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
So I have a question mainly about your research.
Mhm,
So we think of the Middle East as oil rich, right? But it's also a very water-starved region, which is something
mhm.
we don't really hear much. And you pointed out that the Gulf is an Arabian or Persian Gulf, like what you said,
Yeah.
is a key place that connects, these countries like Bahrain, Qatar, and Iran, and all these other countries around there.
Mhm,
And with the growing population, I think it was estimated that around 50 million people will subside on like desalinated water.
mhm,
So
mhm.
how would you combine these complicated systems to make sure that these people get the resources that they need?
Yeah, I think one, knowledge I think is key. And you need to be prepared, right? And it's the knowledge that prepares you, the collaboration that prepares you, understanding how these systems work, understanding how they fail, understanding what the potential risks that could happen to these systems. And as I mentioned, looking at events even that happened elsewhere. So when we are talking about the nuclear reactors, for example, we looked into the big events that happened, right? We looked into Fukushima, for example, that happened. We looked into what happened at different plants in the US. We looked at what we would call near misses, like it's an event that it could have led to something, but it was a near miss and it didn't lead to a catastrophe. Um, all of these things, I think, analyzing these things, looking at the data, is really crucial to understand where things can fail, to have the proper plan if something fails. And because all of these little things also can be indicators of the health of a system, right? You will see when different catastrophes happen and then they produce reports on them, there are little things that led up, right? The perfect brew that happened that led to something occurring. So I think knowledge is really important. Having the right people doing the research, having the knowledge, understanding how these systems work, I think is critical. And I think Fukushima is a good example of this because in Fukushima, we see that there were three nuclear plants that were affected by the earthquake and tsunami that happened. And these three plants had similar conditions, but the outcomes were very different in the three plants. And so Fukushima Daiichi, pretty much everybody has heard about. That plant experienced fatal meltdowns, radiation releases. When someone says Fukushima, people immediately know what this is referring to, right? It's very well known. But then there was Fukushima Daini that was able to safely shut down. But then there was Onagawa, that was pretty intact. And if you say Onagawa, most people probably won't even know what you are talking about because nothing happened there, right? But the reality is that the tsunami was even bigger at Onagawa, but Onagawa was able to safely shut down. And the key difference there was the safety culture because the Onagawa plant, they decided to be extra safe when building their plant, and they built it at a much higher elevation to account for a tsunami, even though they didn't anticipate a tsunami even getting anywhere close to that height, but they decided to be extra safe with the way they built it. So this devastating tsunami came, and that decision saved them. And that destroyed Fukushima, right? We see two very different outcomes because of what was done beforehand as preparation, right? And I think that's where knowledge is really important and also building this culture of safety. And not just knowledge that is important, but to act on that knowledge, right? To do something about it. And that building of safety culture in an industry is really critical. And you want it not only to be in the planning stages of the industry and when you're building something, but also when you are maintaining that system, maintaining that industry, maintaining that reactor, that plant, whatever it is that you are maintaining. You want there to be this culture in the company where, any employee feels comfortable to or feels empowered to speak up if they see something that could be safer, right? This culture really needs to spread on every level of a company. And so, yeah, I think in summary, to answer that is I think knowledge is key, and then to act on that knowledge that we have and to keep seeking that knowledge, right? Because data changes, information changes, we learn new things. And so to keep refreshing that knowledge and acting on that knowledge.
In this case, are you talking about knowledge about water safety or
In how the
well,
systems work, in how the components work, how the critical parts work, how the systems come together and work, the connections between how one industry maybe impacts another, and so on. All of those connections.
Oh yeah, there's a lot to cover with just, the intersection of like engineering, technology,
Mhm.
even like foreign policy, in some of these cases. So you envision having like a linked emergency response plan, not just across the industry, but also across countries, as you've mentioned before. How will that work in the real world of politics and economic competition?
Yeah, so that is a great point, and it's not an easy fix, right? Not an easy solution or not an easy avenue to embark on. And because especially when you're talking about political, economic competition, you're not necessarily focused on collaboration, right? You might be, but it's not always the case. But I think it's important to come to it from the same mindset. At the end of the day, we all want, there are certain things that we unite on, right? We all want safety, we all want sustenance, we all want security. And I think it's important to come from that perspective, putting everything else aside, what are the things we have in common? And therefore, how can we work together to make sure that we collectively, not just industries, but across countries, as you said, are able to collectively ensure that we are able to make that happen for each one of us.
Yeah, that's, I think you said it really well. Thank you.
Thank you.
and so you've said that step by step by highlighting interdependencies, we can kind of build trust in regions where trust is like the foundation of everything. And I was wondering, how do you go about building that trust? Just like how you go about building like, a safety culture in a plant, how would you go about building that sort of that culture?
Yeah, I again I would somewhat link it to the previous point that I think it's important to come from the right from the same mindset, and I also think it's important to have the right knowledge when you're coming into that, and to be pushing for the right research, having data right to support what you're trying to do, seeking the right experts in the fields, and to be very collaborative on this aspect. Be very upfront with sharing data, sharing knowledge, sharing experts, sharing resources, to really build that trust cross industry, cross country, however, whichever perspective you're looking at it from, and really focusing on, again, that we are coming into this wanting the same things, right? So to coming into it from the same perspective, I think is really important, alongside with the right experts, the right research, the right data, and all of that.
Well, what about these companies that do research they do proprietary research and they kind of because like for monetary gain? What would you say about that? Or what do you think about that?
Yeah, I think that's a fair point. I think I mean, there are things that can still be kept proprietary that don't need to be shared, where you can, where there are, how do I say it? Like there are things that can be kept proprietary that doesn't hinder safety and security of the other industries or the other players in the area. So I think it's important to kind of um, uh, separate the two. Basically, that there are things that can be kept proprietary, but also highlighting what are the things that we actually do need to share, and also what agreements can we have in place, right, to keep things maybe still proprietary, but between countries or between certain key players, right, in the industries.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much for joining us on this episode. Before we leave, is there anything that we forgot to ask you that you think it's important to share with our audience?
I think that pretty much covers everything. Yeah.
Advice from former professor and thesis advisor told her, to spread your wings and fly. It changed her thesis topic to one where she was more passionate about. And he said it is your thesis, not mine.
The UAE's unique tapestry relies on the Arabian Gulf for water, for desalination. So many interdependencies and complex connections are happening in her own backyard.
And industries and regions, they need an emergency plan before and not after an accident happens. They need a framework to link industries that normally work independently.
Gemma received the MIT 35 under 35 award twice.
And as we heard, her thesis advisor gave her the important advice to narrow the scope, to cut at the complexity of the thesis objectives.
Well, the history of nuclear accidents at Fukushima Daiichi made her learn a couple lessons. There's three different plants that the Daiichi plant had that were destroyed. The Anagawa survived intact, and two had different outcomes because of the culture of safety and actions taken.
The culture and safety is important, and like we heard, sharing the knowledge of operations and consequences all have risks.
I think one thing we learned, there are certain things that we all have in common, like safety. And that's where we can begin to build a collective response to an emergency, even before it happens.
The energy transition usually focuses on power generation, storage, electric vehicles. But there are other parts of society that are sources of carbon emissions as well. The industrial processes that can be significant include the manufacturing of steel, cement, plastics, and also fertilizer.
Well, it's hard to imagine a modern society without these products. And if they're responsible for a bigger source of greenhouse gas emissions than power generation or transportation, then can't they be ignored as a source of carbon? I wonder if there are new innovations that can create green new products for these industrial sectors.
In this episode, we talked to two researchers from the Payne Institute for Public Policy at the Colorado School of Mines, Anna Littlefield and Edikan Udofia, on the topic of green steel carbon sequestration and other industries processes that need really hot temperatures, like over 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Can renewable sources of electricity make a dent in the carbon emissions of these processes?
We take these industries for granted many times, but they're very important to our economy and global emissions that we can't really leave them behind and still reach climate goals. These processes are often referred to as hard to abate, and at those temperatures and other requirements, you can see why. Let's find out what is up with these critical industry sectors.
I'm a current PhD candidate in the geology department here at Colorado School of Mines. So I've always been interested in energy and earth science processes, and I worked in oil and gas for many years. And I think I've been interested in industrial decarbonization, specifically just because the skill set that is needed to address some of those issues in the hard to abate industries or difficult to decarbonize industries has a lot of overlap with the work that I did in oil and gas. So a lot of the same subsurface expertise for my PhD specifically, a lot of the geochemical considerations that we have to take when we're modeling what happens when you inject CO2 into the subsurface. There's a lot of overlap there, and it's always interested me. And I think just kind of finding a solution to some of the problems that our society's heavy energy appetite has caused is appealing to me.
Traditional steel uses coal or coke, what's called metallurgical coke, which comes from coal, from a certain kind of coal, uses it as a fuel and also as a reducing agent. And this has been the practice in steel manufacturing for as long as steel has been a thing. But then the thing about this thing is that it's very heavy and highly carbon intensive process, right? And just this traditional steel manufacturing by itself accounts for about 7 to 9% of global CO2 emissions. So in the world now, as we know it, exploring and how to still stay relevant, but then have a smaller carbon footprint is how green steel became a thing. So green steel uses hydrogen as a reducing agent instead of using coal or coke. And then typically also the electric arc furnaces that are used to melt down the ore or the furnaces that are used to melt down the ore in like real pure green steel production value chain uses renewable energy for that. And then if they need other sorts of like fuel or reducing agents, they use a lot of bio fuel. So what now? So that is the green steel that now it and like kind of like encapsulated from the very beginning of production value stream. But another approach to it now is where like people like Anna come into play, which is where there's the potential for carbon capture integration, which would then mean that at every um, point where steel is being manufactured, whatever carbon would have otherwise been emitted is now being captured. So that still falls into the area of green steel, but pure green steel, like green steel in its purest form, every component of it like does not emit any carbon at all.
Thank you so much for joining us for the future of energy. Special thanks to each of our guests today and to our technical wizard, Abhi, for his important contributions to this episode. Don't forget to subscribe to our podcast so you can automatically get access to all our new episodes. You can find us on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts.